Who are the Kurds? What's going on in Rojava? What is Kurdistan, and is it feasible? Hopefully, I'll be able to provide the information necessary to help you reach your own conclusions. This is A Layman's Guide to the Kurds, History, Rojava, and Kurdistan. The Kurds are an Iranian ethnic group that span Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey, along with small pockets in other countries. Population-wise, they consist of over 30 million people. In the respective modern countries they inhabit, they have largely been a minority denied linguistic, cultural, and even sometimes civil rights. As a population, they have known a type of oppression very few people outside their group have seen. Let's talk about the details, though. Contrary to popular belief, the Kurds don't speak one language. In fact, they speak multiple languages, and the sections that do speak what is commonly known as Kurdish have varying dialects that in some cases aren't mutually intelligible. This, in itself, is a massive obstacle that stands in the way of a unified Kurdish nation, as will be illustrated. Traditionally, what is commonly known as Kurdish has been classified into the northern, Kurmanji, central, Sorani, and southern, Kermanshahi and Laki groups. Certain linguistic experts consider some of these dialects to be separate languages, while others consider certain dialects to belong to other languages altogether. Outside what is traditionally considered to be Kurdish, there are other languages natively spoken by Kurds, such as the Zazan-Gorani languages, which are separate from the groups of Kurdish we spoke of earlier. The non-Kurdish languages, as one would expect, are not that mutually intelligible with what is traditionally considered to be Kurdish. Complicating things further, the supposed dialects of the Kurdish language don't have all that much mutual intelligibility either, as for example, Kurmanji uses grammatical genders, while Sorani doesn't. In a way, the dialects are similar to each other as German and English are similar to each other. In practice, a Turkish Kurd would have trouble understanding an Iraqi Kurd, which would in turn have trouble understanding a Central Western Iranian Kurd. Yet complicating things even further, the Kurdish people don't all use the same alphabet. The two most common are the Arabic and Latin alphabets. However, certain Kurds use the Armenian and Cyrillic alphabets as well, albeit in smaller numbers. These different alphabets also don't represent the same sounds entirely. For example, the Sorani Arabic alphabet lacks letters that represent the sounds of certain letters in Kurmanji. Kurdish nationalism, like most types of nationalism, is a pretty new thing. Starting after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the intensely religious Kurds rejected the secularization efforts and the ethno-nationalistic programs carried out by the new Turkish Republic. Throughout the years, though, their nationalism took on different forms, some Marxist, some liberal, some even ethno-fascist. Despite the form Kurdish nationalism took, imperialist powers have always took advantage of this nationalism in order to suit their divide-and-rule tactics. An example of this would be the support of Kurdish nationalism the French gave when they colonized Syria. Another would be the many promises the Americans made to the Kurds when attempting to carve up Iraq and make it easier to invade. Arguably, it is also what the Americans are doing now with Rojava. Despite this, though, Kurdish nationalism isn't always a progressive thing. Particularly in Iraqi Kurdistan, anti-Arab sentiments are on the rise, with some espousing the same kind of rhetoric against Arabs as ethno-nationalist Turks espouse against Kurds. Some, in the West, leftist or otherwise, tend to paint the Kurds with a broad brush. The reality is that there are conservative Kurds with their own political parties, social democratic ones that have political orientations that are very friendly to imperialism, and at the same time organizations that have revolutionary and socialist politics that cannot possibly be reconciled, at least in the long run, with Western interests. The take-home message of all this? Not all Kurdish nationalists are created equal. Some are incredibly reactionary, while others are very progressive. We should not support Kurds on the sole basis of them being Kurds. Be critical. A Kurdish nation has been promised to the Kurds numerous times. A nation was promised to the Kurds by the British after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, by the French in Syria, by the Americans during the 80s and 90s in Iraq, and more. Every single time, the promise was broken. Clearly, history has shown us that the West are no friends to the Kurds, and their promises are empty and meaningless. This should lead us to be at least a little bit skeptical of any future promises made to the Kurds by imperialist powers, or morally bankrupt nations such as Israel. Currently, the strongest and most independent section of Kurdistan is Iraqi Kurdistan, which is an area that has embraced capitalism and is run by traitorous comprador bourgeoisie. It will exert a lot of influence on the other Kurdish areas, and most likely stand in the way of a progressive, socialist Kurdish nation, and rather be in favor of an ethnocentric capitalist model like Turkey. Before we talk about this though, let's back up a little bit. Do the Kurds want a nation? If so, which ones? All of them? Do the Kurds constitute a nation in the first place? What are the logistics of this hypothetical Kurdish nation? In the Leninist sense, a case both for and against a single Kurdish nation can be made. The Kurds can be considered to have a relatively uniform culture in some cases, while being radically divergent in other cases. For example, Kurdish music is similar across all Kurds, and is extremely similar to traditional Iraqi, Turkish, and some Iranian music, while customs vary wildly from Kurds in Turkey to Gorani Kurds in Iran. The question is, what would be considered too different for them to not constitute a single nation? Another thing to take into account is that the Kurds don't all speak the same language. They speak numerous languages, each with their own dialects and scripts. In this case, the Kurds cannot constitute a single nation. Regarding a common economic life, well, this is a little trickier, but again, a case can be made both for and against. Let's suppose a single Kurdish nation were to come into existence, though. Which would be the dominant language? Kurmanji, most likely. What would be the dominant script? The Hawar, the Latin alphabet. Which customs would be the most dominant? The Northern Kurdish, the Turkish Kurdish would, most likely. A very realistic possibility would be that the dominant Kurdish group forces their own language and script and customs and traditions, etc. onto smaller Kurdish groups, and hence making this hypothetical Kurdish state no better than its neighbors. And this is assuming that there are insignificant amounts of other minorities such as Turks and Arabs, Assyrians, etc. to deal with in this Kurdish nation. I'm already seeing this sort of reactionary attitude amongst the two Kurdish factions in my own country, Iraq, and this is only happening with 1/4 of a possible Kurdish state. There are only more problems to be faced with if the whole of Kurdistan was taken into account. The decision of how to govern will always be the decision of the Kurds, and the Kurds alone, hopefully. But a federated political system similar to Yugoslavia, for example, with several independent countries/regions, might be the best option, in my opinion. In the end, a good analogy would be to imagine if the Germans, the Swiss, and the Dutch all considered themselves to be a single ethnic group, but still nonetheless had their own languages and customs and traditions, etc. as they do now. In the same vein, a single Kurdish nation state might not make as much sense, but two or more separate Kurdish states, possibly in a federation or a union of various differing republics, would make a little more sense, at least in my opinion. On a side note, not all Kurds want an independent Kurdistan. This needs to be kept in mind. The calls for independence mostly come from Iraq and Syria, while certain sections of Turkey's Kurds simply wanting more autonomy, while others want outright independence, and large sections of Iran's Kurds wanting nothing to do with a Kurdish nation at all. We need to respect the decisions of the Kurds themselves and not favor one group of Kurds over the other, especially when we don't have all the facts together. This is not to say that there shouldn't be an independent Kurdistan, but we should allow the Kurds themselves to choose the how, when, and where. Note, Rojava itself is a sensitive title to use as it means Western in Kurdish, referring to Western Kurdistan. Many groups within Rojava, such as Arabs and Assyrians, use different names for the region, such as Guzarto, Al Jazeera, or Shimal Suria. I'll be using Rojava though, as people in the West are more familiar with this term, but keep in mind that this isn't the politically correct term, at least for the people within Rojava themselves. What is currently being done in Rojava is admirable, but still deserves some critical analysis. Just because it looks good doesn't necessarily mean it is good. After the Syrian Arab army withdrew from northern Syria at the start of the civil war, the Kurds, along with Assyrians and Arabs, Turkmen, and others, took it upon themselves to defend their communities. Eventually, different military groups formed and merged together, with the important player being the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, a coalition of Kurdish, Arab, Turkmen, Assyrian, Syriac, and other militias cooperating against ISIS. Officially, they are the sole military force recognized by Rojava, as outlined by their constitution. In the fight against ISIS, they gradually advanced far beyond Kurdish territory. Now, the SDF occupy many non-Kurdish areas, such as Arab, Assyrian, etc. villages/cities, that they have incorporated into Rojava. In Rojava, the SDF and the relevant political wings started to enact progressive changes, such as pursuing feminist goals, establishing a unique form of grassroots democracy, and at least attempting to provide representation for all people living in Rojava. Keep in mind that the Kurds form only a slim majority of 55%. As of now, Rojava has not made any statements towards independence, nor forming a Kurdish state. However, certain groups they are allied with do call for independence, so we'll have to wait and see how this situation develops. Of course, an ethno-state based on the Kurdish identity in northern Syria would be incredibly problematic, as there are large minority groups that really wouldn't allow such a thing. So, I personally believe, in light of the evidence, Rojava is genuine in their calls for autonomy rather than independence. There have been claims of ethnic cleansing and ethnic/religious discrimination raised against the SDF, but these claims are sometimes unfounded or based on dubious evidence. Nonetheless, we need to take these things seriously. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but in my personal opinion, some cases, very few, of ethnic cleansing are true and did occur, but on a very small scale, and the relevant authorities in Rojava have fought and keep fighting against this sort of thing, to prevent it from happening. I genuinely do believe the governing bodies of Rojava have good intentions and are trying to change things for the better, but changing the superstructure is not the same thing as changing the base. The political ideology of Rojava is democratic confederalism. The best way to familiarize yourself with this ideology is to read the short pamphlet written by Abdullah Salan yourself and make up your mind. For now, though, a quick summary would be as such. The belief in the right to self-determination through democratic confederalist political institutions rather than nation-states. These institutions are not controlled by a state, but they do not negate the existence of the state, meaning they can exist within a state. Grassroots democracy is a necessary prerequisite, at least for the Middle East, the area this pamphlet is intended for. Governance is carried out through grassroots participation, and delegates are elected to higher-level assemblies that carry out the will of their particular communities. And rather than revolution, federal structures should be established within existing states that follow a democratic confederalist line. Side note, although the pamphlet has a generic anti-capitalist feel to it, socialism is not mentioned anywhere as the goal of this ideology. Make of that what you will. Despite the radically democratic political system, their economic principles seem strange. As a side note, they deserve the benefit of the doubt, as it's a war situation currently. But we need to be incredibly critical of how their economy develops, especially with the end of the war in sight. Currently, private enterprises and cooperatives are the largest sections of the economy. The Economic Committee has explicitly stated that the goal is to move more and more towards worker cooperatives, and attempts to help businesses move in that direction. In my personal opinion, co-ops are only a first step towards socialism, and not the end goal. If they aren't aiming past co-ops, then that is a problem. If you'd like to know the issues co-ops bring up, then check out the previous video I made titled Problems with Co-ops. You'll be able to find a link in the description. Further interesting information about Rojava is that the administration of Rojava regularly partners with private companies on some projects, and even invites investors to invest in certain agricultural projects. Rather than abolishing private property, it is explicitly mentioned as a right within the constitution of Rojava, which, in practice, means the privileges of landowners are protected and their land is protected from being seized by the workers that actually work that land. Abdurrahman Himo, the advisor for economic development in Sizira Canton, was asked how he would like the economy of Rojava to work, ideally, with which he answered, "Our main focus for development would be on the social economy, but it will coexist with the open economy and the private economy. We won't create a state economy or a centralized economy." So, not only is the existence of a private sector allowed, but it's considered to be ideal, according to one of the economic advisors in Rojava, one can also infer that with the existence of a private economy and the absence of centralized planning, the existence of the market is maintained and not challenged. All these things should be kept in mind, especially for those that consider themselves socialists. Not everything is so bleak, though, as natural resources and all buildings are considered public property in Rojava. An argument can be made that the materialistic conditions necessary for socialism are not yet in place, and that's the reason why the situation is the way it is. We will need to continue observing the situation, but so far, in light of the evidence, there is no socialism in Rojava. Should we support Rojava? Well, yes and no. Yes, because they're continuing the fight against ISIS, because they're establishing an interesting new form of political structure based on direct democracy, because they're attempting to pursue feminist goals, because they're attempting to minimize ethnic conflict and provide representation for all groups in Syria, because there is some potential in what is going on in Rojava. That is at least a few reasons to support them. However, we shouldn't support them on economic grounds, because so far they have not established socialism, and nor do they seem to be heading in that direction. We shouldn't support them because they have enshrined the right of private property into their constitution, because they have not abolished the market and seem to have no intention of doing so, because they tolerate and even support the existence of a private sector, because, despite their rhetoric, many still hold nationalistic goals that would further balkanize the Middle East, because they have an uneasy alliance with the largest and arguably most evil imperialist power, the United States. These are some reasons as to why we shouldn't support them. In the end, the good outweighs the bad, and their intentions seem genuine, although certain things need a little ironing out. What we should do is provide critical support. We must analyze what they do and reflect on their possibilities as much as we can. As Marx said, we need to ruthlessly criticize everything, whether we personally like it or not, in order to arrive at an informed, mature understanding of the situation. Support Rojava, but support it critically. The video is done, comrades. After this point, you'll have my personal opinion on the whole situation. Stick around if you want to hear it, or go and have fun doing something else if you don't.